My brother-in-law held up my plate with 2 fingers, the way you'd hold a piece of trash you didn't want to touch. Vegetarian option, he announced to the entire Thanksgiving table, loud enough for every one of his country club friends to hear. That's what my sister-in-law eats. She's on a budget? He laughed. My sister laughed. Even my mother laughed, soft and embarrassed, the way she always did when she didn't want to take sides. I sat down, picked up my fork, and said nothing. What none of them knew was that 3 hours earlier I had been on a secure video call with a federal judge and 2 U.S. senators. My name is Avery Caldwell. I'm 31 years old, and for the last 6 years my family has believed that I work as a paralegal assistant for a mid-sized law firm in Baltimore. They think I proofread briefs and fetch coffee for attorneys who went to better schools than I did. They think I share a 1-bedroom apartment with a roommate and click coupons from the Sunday paper. My brother-in-law, whose name is Scott, has made this the centerpiece of every family gathering for the last 4 years. Scott married my older sister Brooke 18 months after I graduated law school, and in that time he has built an entire identity around being the successful one in the family. He owns 3 HVAC franchises, he drives the G-Wagon. He has opinions about wine that he shares whether or not anyone asked. What Scott does not know is that I am a federal prosecutor with the Department of Justice, currently serving as lead counsel on a multi-district racketeering case that involves organized financial fraud across 11 states. My security clearance is higher than my title suggests. I cannot discuss most of what I do. I have never discussed it. And until the day my brother-in-law decided to hand me a boarding pass for a middle seat on a connecting flight through Atlanta while waving his own business class ticket like a trophy, I had no intention of ever discussing it. That changed on a Wednesday morning in November, in Terminal C of Baltimore-Washington International Airport. But I need to back up, because you need to understand what led me to that terminal, and why, for 6 years, I smiled and nodded and ate my vegetarian option in silence. The Thursday before Thanksgiving, I'd just come off a 16-hour briefing session with the prosecution team. We were 6 weeks from trial. The defendant, a man whose name I cannot use, had connections to domestic financial networks that had stolen pension funds from over 40,000 working Americans. I had not slept in 2 days. My eyes were raw. I had a tension headache that had been living behind my right eye since Monday. I drove to my parents' house in Howard County with a casserole dish of roasted vegetables on the passenger seat, because I promised my mother I would bring a side dish, and I was not going to break that promise. I pulled into the driveway behind Scott's wagon, which was parked at an angle that took up most of the space. I sat in my car for a moment, windows fogged, letting the engine idle. Through the living room window I could see the blue flicker of a football game and the silhouettes of my family moving around the table. I grabbed my dish and went inside. Scott was standing at the kitchen island, already opening his second bottle of wine, a Napa cab he'd ordered by the case and talked about at every opportunity. He looked at my casserole dish the way you look at a car that just cut you off. Avery. He said my name like a sigh. What is that? Roasted squash and lentils. Mom asked me to bring a vegetable. He made a face. You know we have a caterer this year, right? This isn't really the aesthetic we were going for. I put the dish on the counter and smiled. Happy Thanksgiving, Scott. My sister Brooke came around the corner in a wrap dress that probably cost $800. She kissed me on the cheek and then immediately looked at the casserole dish with the same expression Scott had used. Oh, Avery, you didn't have to bring anything. Mom asked me to. Right, but we have caterers, she said it the way Scott said it, like I'd shown up to a black tie event in jeans. She lowered her voice. Just put it in the fridge. We'll tell Mom it was delicious. I put the dish in the fridge. We'll tell Mom it was delicious. I put the dish in the fridge. My mother came out of the laundry room, wrapped her arms around me, and asked if I was eating enough. She didn't ask about work. She never did. She was afraid, I think, of not understanding the answer. We sat down, the caterer, an actual caterer, at a Thanksgiving dinner, which I would learn Scott had expensed to the business as a client entertainment event, brought out plates, My mother had mentioned I didn't eat meat, so they had prepared me a separate dish. Scott was the one who picked it up from the kitchen pass-through. He carried it to the table with 2 fingers, held at arm's length, and set it in front of me with a little flourish. "Special order," he said. "She's on a health kick." He sat down and poured himself more wine. "Or a budget. Hard to tell with paralegals, no offense, Avery." There was laughter. Light, social, the kind that fills a room without anyone meaning it. My mother looked briefly at her napkin. My father said, "Scott, come on," in a tone that didn't mean anything. Brooke refilled her own glass. I ate my lentils. I watched Scott hold court for the next 2 hours about his franchise expansion plans, his upcoming ski trip to Aspen, and a deal he was closing that would make him, in his own words, generationally relevant. My father nodded along. My mother kept touching his arm. They were so proud of him. Scott was the son they had never had, and the success story they had always wanted in the family. When dessert came, Scott leaned back in his chair and announced that he had a surprise. He reached into the inside pocket of his sport coat and produced a small envelope. He handed it to my parents. Inside were 2 first-class boarding passes, a Christmas trip to Sedona, Arizona, 4 nights at Enchantment Resort, spa access, private shuttle. My mother burst into tears. "You're too good to us," she kept saying. "Family is everything," Scott said, waving a hand like he was dispersing a crowd. My father stood up to shake his hand. My father, who had not stood up to shake my hand when I was sworn into the bar, or when I was promoted, or when I was assigned to the DOJ. He hadn't known about those things. But still, Scott reached into his back pocket and produced a second, smaller envelope. He set it in front of me. I opened it. Inside was a printed itinerary for the same trip, except my flight was a red-eye with a connection in Atlanta, seat 27B, middle seat. I would arrive 4 hours after the rest of the family. "I tried to get you something better," Scott said, not trying to sound sorry about it, "but you know how it is. Last-minute holiday fares, economy class adds up. And honestly, you're young, you can handle a middle seat. It builds character." He smiled. "Besides, I figured you don't really have the PTO budget for first class anyway." The table was quiet for 1 second before Brooke laughed and said, "Scott," in that voice she used when she thought he was funny, but knew he'd gone slightly too far. My mother looked at me. My father looked at his dessert. I looked at the boarding pass. Red eye. "Atlanta, 27B. "Thank you, Scott," I said. "No problem," he said. He lifted his wine glass. "That's what family's for." I drove home at 9:30. The highway was empty and the radio was off, and I sat with the silence for 45 minutes, hands on the wheel, headache back behind my right eye. I thought about the boarding pass on the passenger seat. I thought about the pension fund victims whose depositions I'd been reading all week. Retirees, bus drivers, hospital custodians, people who'd saved for 30 years and had it extracted from their accounts in 8-digit wire transfers by men in very nice suits. I thought about Scott's wagon. I didn't cry. I don't cry at these things anymore. I pulled into the parking garage of my building in Harbor East. My apartment is not a 1-bedroom I share with a roommate. It is on the 14th floor, and the view faces east toward the Chesapeake, and I bought it 3 years ago because I had been living below my means for so long that the down payment was not a problem. My family doesn't know this. I told them I was renting because I knew they would ask questions, and I cannot answer questions about my work, and every detail of my life that I reveal creates another question I cannot answer. I went upstairs, changed out of my dress, and sat at my kitchen table with a glass of water and a case file I have been meaning to annotate. The apartment was quiet. On the coffee table was a frame with a photo of me and 3 colleagues from my first federal conviction in 2021. We were standing outside the courthouse in suits, squinting into the sun. None of our names appeared in any news coverage. That is by design. I am not invisible because I am unimportant. I am invisible because my work requires it. 6 days later, the Wednesday before the Sedona trip, I was in a secure conference room at the field office when my supervisor knocked and told me something I had not expected. The defendant in our case had filed an emergency motion to suppress evidence. The judge had pushed the hearing to the Monday after Thanksgiving. I needed to be there in person, in Baltimore, not in Sedona. I called my mother that evening and told her something had come up with work and I would not be able to make the trip. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "Avery, this is the third family trip you've missed in 2 years." "I know, Mom. I'm sorry. Scott spent a lot of money on that ticket." "I know. Maybe you should think about whether this job is really worth it." I looked at my ceiling. Through the window, a freighter was moving slow and lit across the harbor. "I'll call you from the holiday," I said. She hung up, and I sat with the silence again, and then my work phone rang with a call from the case agent and I picked it up, and for the next 3 hours I did not think about Sedona at all. The thing is, that is not where the story ends. Because Scott did not let it end there. He texted me that night. It was past 11. "Avery, non-refundable ticket. Just so you know, that's $300 I don't get back." I did not respond. He texted again the next morning, Thanksgiving Day itself. "Hope your work thing is worth blowing off your family. Some of us actually show up." I read it standing in front of my coffee maker. I thought about what I had been doing at 11 o'clock the night before when he sent the first message. I had been reviewing a sentencing memorandum. I thought about what I would be doing the following Monday. I would be standing in front of a federal judge arguing the admissibility of 800 pages of financial records. I didn't respond to that message either, but I did something else. I looked at the itinerary again, the red eye, the Atlanta connection, 27B, and I looked at the separate window on my computer where the DOJ travel portal was open. And I thought about the fact that I had 12 days of official travel credits sitting unused, and that the Sedona field office of the FBI, which I had coordinated with twice in the last year, was 13 miles from Enchantment Resort. I picked up my DOJ phone. I called my supervisor. "Are you going to your family's thing?" she asked. "I think I might," I said, "but I have a reason to be in northern Arizona." She laughed. "Don't you always?" I won't say what the operational reason was. It was real and it was documented and it was approved within 4 hours. What matters is that I drove to the airport on Friday morning. I parked my car in Long Term. I walked into Terminal C with a carry-on bag, my credentials in my inside jacket pocket, and a commercial boarding pass for the red-eye to Atlanta in my hand because I had decided to travel with my family and not separately. And I had decided to be in the middle seat for exactly as long as I needed to be. Brooke and Scott were at the first-class check-in counter when I found them. My parents were already through security. Scott was doing what Scott always did at airports. He was negotiating, loudly. He was asking the gate agent about upgrade availability, about priority boarding, about whether his status entitled him to additional baggage fees waived. He had his wallet open. He was fanning his credit cards. He saw me coming, and his face did the thing it always did. A slight upward curl at the corner of the mouth that was not exactly a smile. "Avery." He said it like a punchline. "You actually came." I said I would try. "Work emergency resolved." He made air quotes with his fingers. Something like that. He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and produced the boarding pass he had printed for me. He held it out between 2 fingers, the same way he had held my plate at Thanksgiving. 27B, he said. "Try not to make eye contact with anyone in first class when you walk through." He looked at Brooke and they both laughed. It's awkward for them. The line around us was not paying attention. But a few people were. A man in a grey suit glanced over. A woman with a stroller looked up. I could feel the shape of the moment. Scott performing for an audience that had not agreed to be an audience. I took the boarding pass. I looked at it. And then I looked at Scott. And I felt something that I had been keeping in a locked room for 6 years finally push the door open. Not rage. Something quieter than rage. Something solid. Actually, I said, I'm going to check in separately. Scott frowned. What do you mean separately? We're on the same flight. I know. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket. I just need to present this first. I pulled out the credentials. Not a credit card, not an ID. A Department of Justice prosecutor's badge in a leather bifold, gold shield on the left, federal photo identification on the right, and below it, a printed travel authorization on DOJ letterhead with a case number and a judge's signature. I placed it on the counter. The agent looked at it. She looked at me. She reached for her phone. Scott laughed. It was the same laugh as always, dismissive, quick, designed to make the other person feel small. What is that, Avery? A prop? Did you get that at a Halloween store? It's a federal prosecutor's credentials, I said. I work for the Department of Justice. The laugh faltered. That's not. You're a paralegal. No, I said. I'm not. The agent had made her call. She was speaking in a low, clicked voice, and I could see the words she was using, and I knew what they meant, and I knew what was going to happen next. She hung up and looked at Scott and broke with a professional, carefully neutral expression. Ma'am, she said to me, can you follow me to the priority desk, please? She lifted the gate divider. I picked up my bag. Wait, Scott said. He was not laughing now. Wait, what is happening? I stopped. I turned to look at him. He was standing there with his platinum credit card still in his hand, his boarding pass in the other, his face doing something I had never seen it do before, recalibrating. Scott, I said, keeping my voice even, do you know why I've missed 3 family trips in 2 years? He blinked. Because your job is. Because I am lead counsel on a federal racketeering case against a man who stole retirement savings from 40,000 people. People who worked 40 years for that money. I have been working on that case for 2 years. I will work on it until we win. I paused. That's why. He opened his mouth. Closed it. You spent 4 years treating me like the family's consolation prize, I said. It was not an accusation. It was just a fact. Stated the way I would state a fact in a courtroom, and I let you, because my work is classified and my life is complicated, and it was easier to let you have the room than to explain any of it. But handing me a middle seat like you're doing me a favor, and calling it charity, and making sure everyone at the table heard you do it, that I'm done with. Brooke had not moved. Her face was a complicated thing. I looked at her for a moment. My older sister, whom I had looked up to for my entire childhood, and I saw that she knew. She had always known or suspected that I was not who I told them I was. She had never asked because asking would have disrupted the arrangement that worked for her. The agent was waiting. I could hear footsteps behind me. Airport security, not aggressive, just present. The way they appear when certain credentials are presented at certain counters. Your boarding pass, Scott said. He was holding it up. Seat 27B. Slightly desperate now. You paid for the seat. I paid. Keep it, I said. I walked to the priority desk. I did not look back at the boarding pass on the counter. I did not look back at my sister's face or my brother-in-law's hand still holding his platinum card. I walked through the corridor that opened up behind the desk, past the TSA supervisor who had been called to escort me, and into the section of the terminal where the quiet is different, where the air feels like something has been removed from it. All the noise and the performance and the social math of who has more. I sat in the gate area. I called my supervisor. I confirmed my travel. I reviewed 40 pages of notes for the suppression hearing. I drank a cup of coffee that was not remarkable in any way, and it was the best thing I had consumed in 6 days. I boarded separately. I do not need to describe my seat. We landed in Phoenix an hour before their connection arrived. I had a car waiting. I was at the field office by noon. I sat in a conference room with 2 FBI agents and a forensic accountant, and we spent 4 hours going through financial records that had been subpoenaed 3 months ago and finally organized into something I could use. I did not go to Enchantment Resort that night. I went to a government-rate hotel near the office and slept for 8 hours without interruption for the first time since October. The next morning, I was sitting on the patio of a coffee shop in Sedona. The red rocks, enormous and rust-colored in the early light, the air cold and clean, when my phone lit up with a text from Brooke. Mom told me about your job. She looked it up. She found your bar registration. Federal prosecutor. She's been crying since last night. I put the phone down. I drank my coffee. Another message. Scott wants to apologize. He's embarrassed. Please don't make this a bigger thing than it has to be. I thought about that framing. Don't make this a bigger thing. Meaning, his embarrassment is the problem. Meaning, help me manage the fallout of this, the way you have always helped manage everything quietly, invisibly, from a middle seat. I picked up the phone. I typed my response carefully. Tell Scott I accept his apology when he's ready to give it himself. And tell Mom I'm okay. I'm good. I'm actually really good. I hit send. I put the phone in my jacket pocket. I looked at the rocks. A man at the next table was reading a newspaper. A couple was arguing gently about which hike to do. Somewhere above me a hawk was doing long, slow circles in the cold blue air. I thought about the first case I ever won. I was 26 years old and I was the second chair on a fraud prosecution that had taken 3 years to build. When the verdict came in, my supervising attorney, a woman named Sandra who had been a federal prosecutor for 20 years, put her hand on my shoulder in the courtroom hallway and said, "You did that. Not we. Not the team." She said, "You did that." And it was the only time in my professional life that I cried in a work context, and I cried because I had never heard those words from anyone who mattered. My family was not there. They didn't know there was anything to be there for. I paid for my coffee. I pulled on my jacket. I had 2 hours before a call with Washington, and the morning was cold and extraordinary, and the rocks were the color of dried blood and old fire, and I had not been outside, truly outside, in months. I walked. There is a trail that starts behind the coffee shop and climbs up toward a ridge with a view of the whole valley. I had looked it up the night before out of habit. I always look things up, and I knew it took 45 minutes round trip, and I had 45 minutes. I climbed. The air thinned, and my lungs worked, and my calves burned in the way that feels like proof that you're alive. When I got to the top, I stopped and put my hands on my knees for a second, and then stood up and looked out. The valley was huge. A river ran through the bottom of it, thin and silver. The town was small from up here, the roads tiny, the cars like moving pixels. Somewhere down there was the resort where my family was having breakfast with mimosas and talking about last night's dinner. I thought about Scott's face at the counter, the recalibration, the way the laugh had dissolved into something uncertain, then something almost frightened, not of me exactly, but of the possibility that he had badly misjudged something for a very long time. I wasn't angry at him anymore. I want to be precise about that, because anger would be too easy, and I have sat with this long enough to know what it actually is. It is grief. It is the grief of being in the same room as your family and being entirely elsewhere, of spending 6 years folding yourself small enough to fit in a space that was not built for you, because you thought that if you could just get small enough they would finally see you and say, "There she is, we've been waiting." They don't. They see a paralegal. They see someone who needs a middle seat. They see the family's smallest story, and they need that story to stay small because otherwise they have to ask what else they got wrong. My phone buzzed. DOJ field team, I answered. "We're ready when you are," the agent said. "Give me 2 minutes," I said. I looked at the valley one more time. I thought about the 40,000 people whose pension money had been stolen, who had never heard of me, who would never know that a woman in a borrowed conference room in Sedona had spent Thanksgiving annotating their financial records while her family was having champagne. I thought, that's fine. That's exactly fine. I turned around and walked back down the trail. The rocks were warm now where the sun had hit them. I moved quickly the way I always move when there is work to do, which is almost always, my heels on the gravel, my breath steady, my hands loose at my sides. When I got to the bottom, I called Sandra. "How are you doing out there?" she asked. "I'm good," I said. And I meant it without qualification, which is not something I say often. "I'm actually really good," she laughed. "Go get them." I got in the car. I drove toward the field office. The red rocks rose on both sides of the road like the walls of something ancient and unbreakable, and the sky above them was the cleanest blue I had ever seen, and I felt, for the first time in longer than I could name, that I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was supposed to be doing, and that the middle seat was behind me and that I was not going back to it, not for anyone. I keep thinking about that trail in Sedona, the way the gravel sounded under my boots, the way my lungs burned near the top, and I think about how I almost didn't go, how for a split second at the bottom I thought, I only have 45 minutes, it isn't worth it, but I went anyway, and from the top I could see the whole valley, and everything that had felt enormous the day before looked exactly the right size. That is what Scott never understood about me. And honestly, what I didn't fully understand about myself until recently, the things that look small from the outside, the quiet job title, the modest car, the middle seat, are not always signs of a small life. Sometimes they are signs of a life that is pointed somewhere specific, somewhere that requires you to travel light and leave no footprint and ask for nothing from people who would not understand anyway. Scott built his life to be seen. Every choice, the G-Wagon, the platinum card, the loud negotiations at the check-in counter, was a performance for an audience he was constantly trying to impress, and I used to think that was a flaw in his character, something petty and shallow. But standing on that ridge, I realized it wasn't cruelty that made him treat me the way he did. It was fear. He needed me to be less so he could feel like more. That kind of need doesn't come from strength. It comes from a place that has never been quiet enough or still enough to figure out what it actually believes about itself. I spent 6 years letting him have that. 6 years of lentils on a plate held with 2 fingers, of middle seats handed out like charity, of don't make this a bigger thing. I told myself I was being professional, being discreet, following protocol, and that was true, but underneath it, if I'm honest, I was also afraid that if I said what I actually did, who I actually was, they would find some reason to diminish that too, that they would look at the badge the same way they looked at the casserole dish, so I made myself invisible before they could do it for me. What I know now is that staying invisible is its own kind of surrender. There is a version of humility that is wise and grounded and genuinely doesn't need the room. And then there is a version that is just fear wearing humility's clothes. I had been wearing the second kind for a long time. The thing that saved me, and I mean this plainly without drama, was the work itself, not the title, not the clearance level or the credentials in the leather bifold, the actual work. Sitting in a conference room at 11 at night, reading the financial records of 40,000 people who lost everything they saved, and knowing that my name was on the brief that was going to fight for them. That is the thing that held, not their applause, not my family's approval. The fact that I knew when it was quiet exactly what I was doing and why. If you are the person in your family who gets handed the middle seat, I want to say this carefully, because I know how it lands. You do not have to prove yourself to them, but you do have to be honest with yourself about whether you are staying quiet, out of wisdom, or out of fear. Those are different things, and only you know which one it is. The rocks in Sedona are the color of something that has been here for 200 million years, and will be here long after every G-Wagon and platinum card has rusted to nothing. I stood up there for maybe 4 minutes before I had to go back down, but I have thought about it almost every day since. The smallness of everything that felt large, the cleanness of the air, the hawk making its slow circles, unbothered, looking for nothing except what it actually needed. I got back in the car. I drove to the office. I did the work. That is the whole story, and it is enough.